Welcome to the Tactical Dent Tech Podcast. You are now part of a small underground movement of dent technicians from all over the world. We are on a mission to change our industry with innovation, intelligence, and skill. But because we don't rely on an insurance company to steer customers our way, we need to do things different. We need to do things smarter. We do that through a network of technicians that we call the Tactical Tech Movement. Now let's get this revolution started. What's going on, all you tactical techs out there? This is John Hiley with the Tactical Dent Tech Podcast, coming to you today with a podcast specifically about high-strength steel. Been a lot of talk over the last, I want to say 5-10 years about the production of this high-strength steel. And at the beginning, it was quite a mystery. I mean, it really moves differently than any other type of metal that I've personally dealt with. There's been times, I think we had Bryce Kelly on our podcast, the PDR Tooltime podcast, and he actually referred to it as alien metal. Now, if you got guys like Bryce Kelly out there, different guys out there in the industry that are basically referring to this metal as alien metal, I know that it's going to be tough for a lot of people to work on, including myself. I mean, I'll admit it. One of the very first times that I worked on a Chevy truck when they went to high-strength steel, and I worked on, I think it was probably about a 10-inch crease on the bedside. I mean, it literally probably took me 5 or 6 times longer than what it would normally take me with a traditional steel, and probably twice as long than aluminum. Now, a lot of that was because I just didn't really understand it. So my goal over the last year was to really tackle something that would allow me to actually understand that damage at a higher level. So I'm going to go into a little bit of a backstory, and some of you DentTrainer.com members have probably already seen the tutorial that I put up on the Chevy roof. Again, it's a Chevy truck, about my repair on this massive dent on high-strength steel. This is one of them dents that, I don't know, perhaps somebody like walked on the roof or maybe got up there and jumped on it a couple times. And it was about the size of, I would probably guess 30 inches by 50 inches. So it pretty much went like from one side of the roof to the other side of the roof, and then it went back quite a ways as well. This thing, it hit hard enough where it basically like pushed down the center console deal inside of the actual vehicle. So the center console had all these like buckles and high spots, right through the middle there. And then it had kind of like a giant bow tie, if you can imagine a giant bow tie that had 2 big dips on both sides of the center, and the center kind of like little jagged spots that were poked up. And I knew that this would be a perfect repair because it's a roof, fully repairable. I mean, there was nothing about it that I looked at and said, wow, this thing might not come out. But basically, it gave me the time to do the test and the experiments needed to figure out exactly why high-strength steel does what it does. Here's some of the conclusions that I came to while I was working this dent, okay? Number one, I started off with like some Cola Fria, and just to see if it would work, and it did shallow it up. It actually took up a couple body lines and things like that, and it made it a little bit better. But that big kink in the center of the roof, there was no doubt that area right there was holding the entire repair from flowing and moving back. So it had a lot of crown works around it, right? So a lot of waves and ripples around the perimeter of the dent. And I worked and worked and worked. And one of the biggest things that I learned about high-strength steel is that when you go in to do a knockdown session, if you take like a soft tip push and you go to knock it down, it beats a dent back into the panel. So essentially the perimeter of the high spot can't hold the tension that you just put in the panel by creating the high spot. The metal is much softer. So you get in this, I would call it like a downward spiral of pushing up and trying to knock down like you do traditional steel, and you end up just beating like big dents and lines and stuff like that, and then you spend a lot of time doing cleanup work on the damage that you created while you were trying to fix the dent. So that was the big issue with high strength steel. Now, what I found was pretty amazing on that roof. And if you go to denttrainer.com, it's up there at the top. It's definitely in the advanced section. But it's a tutorial on how you can control the flow of that metal. And what it is, if you basically you need to get a tool down into the center of that damage while you do the crown work. The crown wants to go back to its natural position, but if you tap it without putting an off dolly or some pressure in the low, like sending the low upwards while you're doing your knockdown work, then you're going to beat the thing down into a bunch of dents. It wants to flow with the metal, but you have to control the flow of the metal. So, for an example, like on that big dent that I was repairing, I started to do the crown work and it just wasn't going anywhere. It was going down with a bunch of divots, and so I stopped. I stopped right there and I said, you know what? Let's go ahead and take my tool. All right. So, and I actually used a Zircus rod. And because you can hold basically very little pressure to control the flow of high strength steel. So very little pressure controls the flow. So I took a Zircus rod and I put it right behind the crown. So in a sense, like you got a crown there, probably 2 inches ahead of the crown where I wanted that metal to flow. And I held a little bit of tension on there. Not enough to create a high spot, but enough to control the flow. And basically, I took my tactical blending hammer. I put the rubber crown killer ball up on the top of the hammer and basically held down pressure while I tapped behind the crown, sending the metal to where my tool was holding pressure. And I worked the entire repair like that. I mean, it was all about basically controlling the flow. It was about holding a little pressure in one spot, hitting the crown, and sending it to that spot where you're holding the pressure. And that metal moved and flowed like butter. I mean, it was just like, it was basically, you have to control the damage from both sides. And that's what I've came down to. That's what I've broken it down to with high strength steel. You have to find a way to control the damage with both sides. And if you're doing a dent, let's say you're doing one, I did one recently on the front of a hood. Okay, so it was a Chevy truck, front of the hood. I actually held some pressure with a soft tip in the center of the dent, and I started working the crown with my blending hammer around it. So literally I'm doing two things at once. I'm holding pressure on the bottom where the low is, and then I'm taking the blending hammer and I'm working the top at the exact same time. Basically, that gives the stability to the panel, which doesn't allow it to divot or fall back in, okay? So that's where the battle becomes. I mean, that's the thing, guys. You really have to control the flow of that metal. Now, all the scientific crap and all that stuff, I don't know. Look, I don't know what it's made out of, how it's made. I basically just look at how to repair it and how to repair it with paintless dent removal. So I can teach you guys the simplest way to work on something. Another thing that I'm finding with high strength steel is that when you do, in a sense, when you do glue pulling on it, glue pull is really nice, okay? So hail damage dents, I believe glue pull is really nice, right? But you got to be super careful. You actually got to pull and hold. So high strength steel, you'll be able to create much higher little high spots, especially if you're glue pulling a roof or something like that. But you literally have to pull and hold. High strength steel, for whatever reason, you can risk putting a dent on the backside of the dent if you pull too fast. It like sends a ripple wave, sending a low to the left or right of the high spot. And I actually contended with that on a vehicle that I have in here. And one of the weird things about it was there were some small dents that I didn't do the hold method where I just held the steel up for a little while. And it literally left a worse dent beside the dent that I was glue pulling. So when I snapped it or when I, went through and tried to just do a couple little small pumps on the metal, it would leave a dent to the left or to the right of the dent. And it was usually worse than the dent that I was glue pulling, which sucks. So I'd have to go back in and glue pull that spot. But what I found with it is, again, if you can just hold some pressure on it and just kind of get your mini lifter there and just hold some nice tension on it, right? And then don't ever overpull that stuff. If you do overpull that stuff, when you go into the knockdown session, you're going to beat a giant low around where that high was. It's literally that high is going to drive down perimeter metal. Unless you got a way to hold that perimeter metal up while you're doing your knockdown work, creating giant highs on high-strength steel is usually the worst thing you can do. So you want to think about controlling the metal, controlling your pulls. You'll find that it'll pull really easy, but you just pull it up just enough and you watch that perimeter. Put a smaller tab in there, watch the perimeter, make sure that it goes high, hold some tension, and then let go. Spray some alcohol on your tab and be really careful about snapping it off. So you can kind of do the pull snap on it, but if you tilt that tab down into the side of the panel, high-strength steel is much more likely to dent from the edge of the tab than any other metal that I've ever worked. So anyhow, guys, I hope you got a lot out of this podcast. I really wanted to just get out there and put some things out there in a way that I can help y'all out. If you guys come across them issues, you guys know I'm like the mad scientist, so when something kind of comes across my my radar here and I have problems with it, I like to try to discover a way to fix it so I can help other people, fix it and do well with it. So anyhow, y'all, appreciate you for coming along with this tutorial. And as usual, I'm going to see you on that next one.